Welcome, everyone. So, among the most important challenges highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic are the issues of access and equity in education. At GSL, one of the things we're focused on this year is to try and understand what it means for our school leaders to operate with an equity focused mindset and approach to improving student outcomes. And so we're very excited to have with us today Dr. Sujatha Rao, someone who wears many different hats, an adjunct professor at the School of Education at Azim Premji University in India. She has worked extensively on developing a specialization on school leadership and management within the master's program. She's also part of the core group designing postgraduate curriculum at the Indian School of Development Management. And Dr. Rao has also been a teacher, having taught at the universities of Sydney and Western Sydney in Australia, and is also the co-founder of two wonderful initiatives, Viridia's Social Impact, an organization that works on creating a collaborative ecosystem to tackle complex social change, and Chubby, a technology-based mobile platform that supports out-of-school adolescents using personalized learning pathways. Dr. Rao, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Aniket. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So diving straight into it, my first question for you is, what do you believe are the most important mindsets for school leaders when it comes to understanding and addressing the issues of equity and access in their schools?
Yeah, I think you started off, today's conversation with foregrounding what's happening with COVID-19 and the pandemic, right? And events like the pandemic just highlight or spotlight issues of equity and access that more often than not is commonplace in schools, right? So these are not outlier events that happen once in a while, but central or core to what we call quality education, right? So one can't talk about quality without talking about equity, equality, and of course, access. So, before we sort of look at the mindsets of school principals towards equity and access, it may be useful to think about a way by which we could look at what is equity of access, right? Because they sort of go together. So one way of thinking about equity of access is the ability of all students to receive an education. And when we say an education, we mean quality education that comprises of, qualified and trained teachers, safe, healthy spaces for learning. So your school is a safe space with sufficient resources, right? So all of these together, and receive that education in a manner that is reasonably equal amongst what their peer group gets, right? And that's an interesting way of looking at equity of access, because we don't necessarily say equity of access is I get to go to a school. That's one kind of access. But equity of access is when I go to a school, how can I compare the education that I receive in this school as compared to education that another child receives when he or she goes to another school? But more importantly, within my school, intra-school, what are the differences in terms of educational experiences, right? So equity of access is not just comparison between schools or, between states or districts or countries, but very much what happens in terms of differential educational experiences inside a school, right? With one child perhaps not experiencing the same quality as compared to another child. So if we frame equity of access like that, then we can come back to the question which you sort of started off with. What are these mindsets, right, that school principals need to have? And let's reframe it to say, what is an equity mindset? What could we define an equity mindset to be? So all mindsets are these deeply held personal belief system structures, right? They sort of structure your thinking and consequently your action. So if we say that an equity mindset is a deeply held personal thought structure of school principals that are used by school principals to not only advocate, but consistently work towards equitable educational outcomes for every child in their school, right? So if we sort of look at it at the broadest level, it's a belief system. And the belief system is that in my school, not only do I, as a school principal, have to advocate for and keep equity at really the center of all of the educational experiences in my school, but how do I translate that into action? It's not just the talk of equity, but the action of equity that I believe is possible. And I genuinely believe that every child needs an equitable education, because ultimately what is the input required for one child may be very different from what is the input required for another child. So the minute we start thinking equitable for each child, we start thinking about other aspects of schooling that are often different from traditional ideas of one kind of education for all. So, that's sort of an equity mindset to start off with.
Got it. That's really helpful. And I think a very important point that you make about thinking about what's happening inside the school. And so, how do you think school leaders can address some of these issues that they do come across either at a school level or within the communities that they're working with?
So I think there have been a lot of studies that have looked at what do teachers and school principals think about equity, right? So we're starting with the mindset and then we are moving into action. So what do they think about it? And studies after studies have indicated that teachers and principals both genuinely say that they understand the importance of equity, and they understand the importance of equity of access, right, for a child. But they also say they struggle with articulating what equity means in practice. And that's where the challenge lies, right? So one is the mindset and the belief that every child is individual and I need to do what is best. And, the word we use in equity is fair, right? What is fair for this child? But the second question is, what do I do then, right? To make that equity jump. So there are certain things, right, that school principals can begin to think of. And one useful way of thinking about equity-led instructional leadership, right, as the basis for action in schools, is to differentiate it from equality or quality-based school education, right, which often are the triangle. So what are these differences? For a very long time in education, particularly in schools, we talk about standardization, right? And there is a certain benefit to standardization in the sense we talk about at grade level, at par, we talk about common resources, we talk about resources that are standardized, teacher education that's standardized. So standardization has its place in education. But for equity to work, school principals need to start to think about individualization and not standardization. And individualization means stepping back from a one size fits all approach at a grade and ask questions about what would best work for this child, right? And begin to see the question of what is the teaching approach that I take in this classroom, or what is the standards that I use in my grade, as not generic, but adaptable. So the minute I say I'm not looking at standardization alone, but I'm looking at individualization, I'm not looking at generic, which is it applies to everybody, but I'm looking at adaptable, what can be adapted to suit this particular child. When I am moving away from a group focus, all grade 4 children, all grade 5 children, and I'm beginning to personalize that, and I'm beginning to ask, what does equity mean for Sheila, right? Or what does equity mean for Rahul? The opportunities that schools and school principals have is to rethink instructional design, right? Is to rethink pedagogy, is to rethink curriculum. and to rethink resourcing. And ultimately, that's where equity begins to take root in the classroom. Otherwise, equity remains a chatter, right? It remains a narrative. It remains a background noise. We all talk about equity, but the struggle happens when you want to move it from chatter into action, right? So just a reframing to say, when I say equity, I'm beginning to talk individualized, adaptable, personalized resources, pedagogy, curriculum for the child, and individualized, adaptable relationships with communities or with parents. Then I'm moving closer towards equity. And this is now, it now becomes more doable because I can put my attention to each of these elements and say, what can I do to make it more adaptable, more individual, and more personalized? So that's one way that school principals can think about it.
That's very helpful framing. Thank you. And what do you think the impact of this kind of an equity focused leadership looks like at a school level?
Um, so there are two ways of looking at it, right? And one is at a meta level, right? What does it do to a school overall? And then what does it look like in interactions between children and teachers, and the academic growth and the academic climate of a school, right? So what does it do to a school overall? One of the most fascinating things, or one of the most fascinating research that comes out of equity focused instructional design practices is that schools that have the smallest achievement gap between demographics, right? So, children who are, either have learning challenges, have sociocultural, capital lacunae, do not have home support, come from different, socio-ethnic, racial backgrounds. Schools that have the smallest achievement gap between different demographics of students have the highest overall achievement rates. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that when a school attempts to provide equitable and fair education for the most disadvantaged students, students from privileged backgrounds also improve. So there is a collective improvement, which means that the school becomes a high performing school, and intra-school differences start to lower or they start to reduce. And that does something magical to schools, right? It becomes a high performing school, not only in terms of, we perform really well in tests, right, or standardized testing or academic testing, but because there is a consistent belief system that every child in the school can perform well, right? And that belief is reinforced by practices. So that's at a macro level. What does it do at a micro level, right? What does it do to teachers and students and parents and community? Teachers start to believe that they can teach better. Teachers begin to understand that curriculum and syllabi that they use are simply North Star pointers, right? They're just sort of pointers that tell you this is where your navigation can be with the child. But ultimately, that a teacher's sense of a student and a teacher's recognition of a student's resourcing requirement, whether it's pedagogic or curriculum or a laptop or parental support, teachers understand that their role is to mediate that, right? And that they are better able to respond to those needs without worrying about, standardized, we call microscripts, right? You have to do this every day. So it builds a lot of resilience and a lot of confidence in teachers. Teachers begin to take greater and greater ownership. And we always talk about distributed leadership in schools, right? And where does distributed leadership lies but with teachers? So that's very powerful. The second is the strength of relationship between teachers and students, right? Students recognize that what teachers offer them are pathways to success, right? And so there's trust-based relationships between teachers and students. The third, assessments and the way that assessments are done are predominantly used as formative assessments, right? Teachers use this to go back to that principle of fairness and equity, right? So is this assessment too hard for you? rather than, oh, you didn't do so well in this grade, right? You didn't do so well in this test, right? So how can I modify it? What can I learn from the assessment to help provide you the resources that you need to do better? So assessment changes. Parents increasingly feel confident in the teaching learning processes in school. And as their child improves, parents begin to engage more with schools. So there's stronger relationships between communities and parents and schools. So there are these numerous signals that a school has sort of moved in that direction, and it does something fairly magical at different levels, right? Whether it's at teachers, whether it's at students, whether it's a community, and it's a very powerful culture building aspect of a high performing school. And certainly for principals, it's the energy that drives them towards better instructional practices as well.
That's such an interesting and what a powerful data point there is. Thank you for sharing. So, my final question for you today, Dr. Rao, is what's your one piece of advice, maybe for school leaders or maybe even for school leadership programs that are looking to support their leaders to build equity focused leadership skills? Where should they begin?
I think the, again, there are two places that school leaders can start with, right? And this is what generally happens. One is what we call the overall school climate ethos or culture, right? Where school principals begin to talk about the centrality of equity of access for all students in the school, until everybody's mindset acknowledges that, right? And says equity necessarily means that things will be differentiated for each student and not standardized for each student. And that's a tremendous mind shift change, because we've all been trained to say one class, one group, one syllabus, one curriculum, one test, all children are whatever, they're all goldfish, right? But to recognize that in a classroom they're not all goldfish, but then you have a shark and you'll have a turtle and you'll have a squid. The foundational basis of that is for teachers to recognize that when a child is not on par with another child, what can I do from an equity lens to bridge that gap, right? How can I move that child forward? So one is this, at this level, right? A mental change, a climate change in school that acknowledges equity as the core of school's instructional practices. The other, of course, that's one thing. And usually this is a time consuming thing. It's very necessary because you can't move forward without it, but it takes time for people's mindsets to work. The other way of what school principals can do is not to start from a mindset change, but to start from practice changes, right? So you flip it and you say, yes, mindset is important and we'll keep working on it. But you know how sometimes actions speak louder than words? When you have evidence for something working, mindset changes, right? You begin to believe, oh, this is possible. So another way that school principals can approach it is to re-look at instructional practices in the classroom, right? And to start looking at simple grade level work. So if I've got a grade 1 or a grade 2, to say, in this classroom, how can we understand the individual child? And today we have techniques and methods by which you can assess students at an individual level, right? Not at a standard level, but at an individual level. And the assessment is not just academic assessment, how well you've done in the test, but assessing the child holistically, right? What is the child's socioeconomic background? What is the child's cultural requirements? What is the child's parental and family support? What is the child's learning requirement, right? Is this a visual learner? Is he a textual learner? Is she a, kinesthetic learner? It may sound demanding, but like everything else, when it begins to happen the first time around, it seems like a mammoth exercise. But once it's done, the data from which you can work towards equitable access is just exponential, right? Because after that, you already have a base by which you can start building what you call differentiated instructional practices in classroom. So, and this is, school principals can involve teachers in this, they can involve parents and communities in this. There are examples of how schools have had parents come back and describe the child and how a child is at home, and teachers talking about how the child is at school, and comparing and contrasting and building this big picture of who a child is. So there are these two ends of the spectrum. They have to meet. Culture work and belief systems is one. Practice work at the classroom, and I would suggest that classroom related work is very powerful because teachers are involved in that, right? It's working with teachers, and that can be very powerful for so if that's the one thing that I would ask principals to think about, is if you were to bring an equity of access lens to your school, how would you bridge the talk versus action gap, right? The intent versus action gap. And I would say start very simply at a classroom level. Have a day in which teachers don't teach, but just learn about their students. And it's a very worthwhile activity because, you might be teaching for 200 days, but that 1 day or 2 days spent in learning the individual child is going to help accelerated learning for the remaining 200 days of the year. So that might be a useful place for principals to start.
This has been so insightful. I'm really glad that we were able to have you here today for this conversation. Thank you once again for joining us today and sharing all this with us.
Thank you, Aniket. It was wonderful talking to you. Thank you.